There's a moment in every person's life, a quiet, almost invisible moment when they realize that the noise around them is louder than the voice within them. A moment when the opinions of strangers feel heavier than their own convictions. A moment when someone else's words, someone else's judgment, someone else's cold silence or burning criticism reaches inside of them and rearranges everything. And in that moment, without even knowing it, they have handed over the most powerful thing they possess. They have handed over their peace. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is what happens when no one teaches you the ancient art of selective attention. This is what happens when the world tells you that caring about what everyone thinks is called being sensitive, being social, being human, when in truth, it is the beginning of a very long and very painful kind of slavery. 2,000 years ago, a man sat in a cold, austere room by candlelight and wrote words into a private journal that he never intended for anyone to read. He was one of the most powerful men in the known world. He commanded armies, governed nations, and held the fate of millions in his hands. And yet, the thing he wrestled with most was not politics, not war, not the complexity of empire. The thing he wrestled with most was other people, their pettiness, their ingratitude, their envy, their dishonesty, their cruelty. And every single day, he returned to the same practice, to train his mind to remain unmoved, to do his duty without needing applause, to give his best without requiring recognition, to be insulted without being injured. That man was Marcus Aurelius, and the journal he kept became one of the most profound documents in human history, the Meditations. What he understood, what Epictetus understood from his years as a slave, what Seneca understood from his years in exile, is something that the modern world has almost completely forgotten. The understanding that your mind is the only territory you truly own, that what other people think of you exists entirely outside that territory, and that the moment you allow their thoughts to govern your actions, your emotions, your identity, you are no longer free. Today, we are going to go deep into that understanding. We are going to talk about the Stoic secret that almost no one talks about in the self-help world. We are going to talk about the power of ignoring people, not out of arrogance, not out of coldness, not out of superiority, but out of wisdom, out of self-respect, out of a commitment to something higher than the constant, exhausting project of managing what everyone around you thinks about you. This is not a short conversation. This is not a surface-level list of tips. This is a full immersion into one of the most transformative ideas in the history of human philosophy. And if you stay with me all the way through, I promise you that by the time we are done, you will never look at other people's opinions the same way again. Let us begin. Welcome to Stoic Wisdom, the channel dedicated to helping you build an unshakable mind, a disciplined life, and a character rooted in something real and lasting. If you are new here, I am glad you found this place. This channel exists for one reason: to bring the ancient wisdom of the Stoics into the reality of your everyday life, not as museum philosophy, not as academic theory, but as living, breathing, practical guidance for the moments that actually test you. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. We release content regularly that is designed to go deep, not shallow, into the ideas that actually change how you think, how you feel, and how you move through the world. If you have been with us for a while, if this channel has been part of your journey, then you already know what we are about. And I want to take a moment to sincerely thank you. Your support means everything. Every like you leave on these videos, every comment you write, every time you share this content with someone who needs it, you are helping this message reach people who are genuinely searching for it. So please, before we go any further, if you get value from this video, press that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it means the world to this channel. And if you want to go even further, if you want to show your support in a real and meaningful way, consider supporting Stoic Wisdom through Super Thanks. That support allows us to keep creating this kind of in-depth, long-form content. It allows us to go deeper, stay longer, and cover the ideas that actually matter. So if this work has helped you, please consider it. Also, I want to hear from you. In the comments below this video, I want you to write one thing. Tell me the name of one person or one type of person whose opinion affects you more than it should. You don't have to explain, just name the pattern. Because the first step in freedom is honesty about what is holding you captive. Now, let us talk about the power of ignoring people. Chapter 1. The world that will not stop talking. We live in a world that has never been louder. Think about that for a moment. In every previous era of human history, the circle of voices a person had to contend with was relatively small. Your family, your neighbors, your community, perhaps the occasional traveling stranger who passed through and offered a judgment before moving on. The scope of opinion was limited. It was manageable. It was human in scale. Today, that circle has no boundary whatsoever. You wake up in the morning, and before your feet have even touched the floor, you are already in contact with thousands of potential judges. You open your phone, and you are immediately swimming in opinions. Opinions about what you should look like, opinions about what you should believe, opinions about what you should eat, wear, say, think, feel, and aspire to. And embedded within all of that noise is a constant, low-grade hum of evaluation of people looking at you, assessing you, approving of you, disapproving of you, comparing you, measuring you. And the terrifying thing is that most of us have adapted to this. We have normalized it. We have accepted the idea that other people's constant assessment of us is just part of life. That scrolling through commentary and judgment is just what mornings are for. That building our decisions around what will be received well is just called being smart. But the Stoics would look at this world and they would recognize something immediately. They would recognize it because they wrote about it in different words, in a different century, in a different world, and yet the pattern is exactly the same. They would look at this world and they would say, "You have lost your center." Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, and I want you to hear this slowly. He wrote that a man who chases reputation after death does not recognize that those future people will also be mortals like himself, who will also die, and who will never even know him in the first place. He was pointing at something profound, that the pursuit of approval in any form, from any direction, is a kind of madness. Because the people whose approval you seek are themselves temporary, themselves confused, themselves seeking approval from someone else. Think about that chain. You are trying to impress someone who is trying to impress someone who is trying to impress someone else. And at the end of that chain, there is no one. There is no fixed point of ultimate judgment. There is no final authority who gets to declare that you were good enough, impressive enough, worthy enough. It is circles all the way down. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of the greatest philosophers in history, understood this from the most visceral possible place. He was a man who had literally no social status, no possessions, no freedom in the conventional sense. He was owned by another human being, and yet, from within that condition of absolute external powerlessness, he discovered something that no one could take from him. He discovered that his judgments, his internal responses to what happened to him, were entirely his own. He wrote, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the opinions about things." And he wrote, "Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life." Now, what does this have to do with other people's opinions? Everything, because the single greatest source of disturbance for most human beings is not what happens to them, it is what other people think about what happens to them, and what other people think about them in general. It is the fear of being seen as stupid, as weak, as unsuccessful, as undesirable, as irrelevant. It is the constant, grinding anxiety of social evaluation. And the Stoics are telling us that anxiety is not built into reality. It is built into your opinions about reality. And opinions, unlike external circumstances, can be changed. This is the beginning of the power of ignoring people. Not a technique, not a social strategy, but a fundamental reorientation toward what is real and what is merely perceived. What matters and what merely feels like it matters. The world will not stop talking. People will always have opinions. Critics will always exist. Envious people will always find reasons to diminish what you do. Indifferent people will always be indifferent, and their indifference will sometimes feel like a verdict on your worth. None of that will stop. But your response to it, your inner response, that is the territory where everything changes. Chapter 2, The Dichotomy of Control, the most important idea you will ever learn. Before we go further, we need to lay the foundation. Because everything else in this conversation rests on a single idea, the single most important idea in Stoic philosophy. An idea so simple that you can explain it in one sentence, and yet so profound that most people spend their entire lives failing to apply it. The idea is this: some things are in your control, and some things are not. That is it. That is the whole thing. Epictetus opens his Enchiridion, his handbook, on how to live with exactly these words. He says, some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. Now read that again. Reputation is in the list of things not in your control, not partially in your control, not mostly in your control, not something you can influence a little bit. Reputation, what other people think about you, is listed alongside things like body and command, in the category of things that are simply not yours to govern. This is radical. This is almost scandalous to modern ears. Because we have been trained by every social institution that has ever touched us to believe that reputation is something we must carefully manage, protect, cultivate, and defend. We believe that our social image is a kind of second self, and that maintaining it is a serious and important responsibility. But Epictetus is saying something different. He is saying that this belief is itself the source of your suffering, because you are investing tremendous energy, emotional energy, mental energy, creative energy into something that you fundamentally cannot control. And when you invest in what you cannot control, you will always be disappointed, you will always be anxious, you will always be vulnerable. Think about what it means that reputation is not in your control. It means that even if you behave perfectly with complete integrity, total kindness, absolute generosity, some people will still think badly of you. And this is not a hypothetical. This is historical fact. The greatest human beings who have ever lived, the ones whose lives, when examined closely, reveal almost incomprehensible courage and virtue and sacrifice, those people were despised by their contemporaries. They were mocked, rejected, exiled, imprisoned, executed. Socrates was one of the most brilliant and honest minds in all of human history. He was killed by popular vote. The people of Athens, the city he loved and served his entire life, decided that he was guilty of corrupting the youth and impiety, and they executed him. His reputation in his own time was destroyed by people who did not understand him, were threatened by him, and wanted him gone. If Socrates could not protect his reputation, if a man of that caliber, that wisdom, that integrity could be completely misunderstood and destroyed in the court of public opinion, then what exactly are you defending when you exhaust yourself trying to manage what people think of you? The dichotomy of control is not a philosophical nicety. It is a survival tool. It is the framework that allows you to direct your finite energy toward the things that actually respond to your effort, and to release your grip on the things that do not. What is in your control? Your choices, your values, your effort, your response to what happens to you, the quality of your character, the way you treat people, the things you decide to pursue, the way you speak to yourself in the silence of your own mind. What is not in your control? Whether people like what you do, whether they understand your intentions, whether they give you credit, whether they approve of your choices, whether they remember you well, whether they see you the way you see yourself. And here is the liberating consequence of really understanding this division. Once you stop fighting to control the uncontrollable, you suddenly have enormous amounts of energy available for the things that actually matter. You stop spending your days in a constant low-grade defensive crouch, protecting your image. You stop crafting every interaction as a performance designed for an audience. You stop waking up anxious about who might be thinking what about you, and you start directing all of that recaptured energy toward building something real. This is what the Stoics mean when they talk about living according to nature. They don't mean living in the woods. They mean living in alignment with what is actually true about reality, including the truth that other people's minds are their own territory, not yours to colonize. The dichotomy of control is the beginning of ignoring people not because you are cold, but because you have finally understood where your power actually lives. Chapter 3. What other people think of you is none of your business. There is a phrase that has been floating around self-help circles for some time now, and it has become so popular that it has started to lose its force. But I want to bring it back to its original meaning, because beneath the cliché is something genuinely profound. The phrase is, what other people think of you is none of your business. When people hear this, they often react with either a kind of relieved agreement, yes, that sounds right, or a defensive skepticism that can't really be true. Though, can it? What about your career? What about your relationships? What about the real consequences of reputation? And these are fair questions. Let me address them directly. The Stoics were not naive. They lived in a world where reputation had real-world consequences, where your standing in the community could determine your access to resources, your legal protections, your safety. Seneca, who spent years as one of the most powerful advisors in Rome, understood perfectly well how social dynamics worked and how dangerous it was to fall out of favor with the wrong people. He was not counseling willful social oblivion. What the Stoics were counseling was something more precise and more difficult: the complete internalization of the idea that your worth and your peace of mind are not determined by external assessment, that you can take your reputation seriously as a practical matter, as something that affects how the world responds to you without allowing it to become the source of your self-concept, without allowing it to become the thing you live for. There is a crucial distinction here between two different relationships to reputation. The first relationship is strategic. You understand that reputation matters as an external variable. You make thoughtful choices about how you present yourself. You build trust through consistent action. You understand that the world responds to how you are perceived, and you try to align your perception with your reality. This is perfectly reasonable. This is practical wisdom. The second relationship is existential. You experience your reputation, what people think of you, as a direct measure of your worth as a human being. When someone criticizes you, you feel diminished. When someone praises you, you feel enlarged. Your emotional state fluctuates constantly based on the social temperature around you. You make decisions based on what will generate approval rather than what you actually believe is right. You are, at the deepest level, dependent on the judgment of others in order to feel okay. The Stoics are asking you to live in the first relationship and refuse the second, to deal with reputation practically, while grounding your identity somewhere that cannot be reached by other people's opinions. And here is where the phrase becomes true in its deepest sense. What other people think of you is none of your business, because it lives in their mind, not in reality. Let me say that again. What someone thinks about you exists in their consciousness. It is shaped by their history, their biases, their projections, their fears, their own unresolved psychological material. The image of you that lives in someone else's head is not you. It is a story they have constructed about you, based on limited information, filtered through all of their own distortions. When someone judges you harshly, they are not seeing you. They are seeing their version of you, a character in their own internal narrative, shaped by whatever triggers and associations and past experiences have primed them to see what they see. And you cannot control that story. You cannot rewrite it from the outside. You cannot fix their version of you. It is theirs. So what business is it of yours? Now, this does not mean you ignore feedback entirely. It does not mean you dismiss all criticism as irrelevant. Part of Stoic wisdom is the genuine humility to recognize that sometimes other people see things about you that you cannot see yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about accepting honest criticism, seeking out those who would correct him, and being grateful when someone pointed out his errors. He did not build a wall against feedback. He stayed open to it. But there is a massive difference between genuinely useful feedback, specific, grounded, offered by someone who knows you and cares about your growth, and the ambient noise of other people's judgments, projections, and reactions. The first is worth listening to. The second is worth releasing. The power of ignoring people is, at its core, the practice of distinguishing between these two categories. It is the discipline of asking, is this person's opinion actually relevant to my growth? Does this criticism point at something real? Or is this simply someone's emotional reaction, someone's projection, someone's attempt to diminish what they cannot understand or what threatens them? And once you have made that distinction clearly, once you have genuinely internalized that most of what other people think about you is a story they are telling themselves, not a verdict on reality, something extraordinary happens. You stop reacting, you stop defending, you stop performing, and you become, for perhaps the first time, genuinely free to be exactly who you are. Chapter 4. The Inner Citadel, building a mind that cannot be invaded. Marcus Aurelius had an image he returned to again and again in his private writings. He called it the Inner Citadel, the idea that at the center of every human being, beneath all the social roles and external pressures and fluctuating circumstances, there exists a fortress, a place that is essentially impregnable, a place where no external force, no insult, no loss, no betrayal, no failure can reach without your permission. He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And elsewhere, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." But the inner citadel is not something you are born with fully formed. It is something you build, deliberately, through practice, through 1,000 small choices to return to your own center, rather than running toward the noise outside. Think of it this way. Every person has an internal world and an external world. The external world is everything outside your skin, other people, events, circumstances, the environment. The internal world is everything inside your thoughts, your values, your emotional responses, your interpretations, your decisions. Most people live primarily in the external world. They wake up and immediately orient themselves toward what is happening out there. What is everyone doing? What are they saying? How is the social landscape arranged today? Am I in or out? Am I up or down? Am I approved of or disapproved of? They are like ships without anchors, moved entirely by the currents of external events. The Stoic practice of building the inner citadel is the practice of reversing this, of becoming someone who begins from the inside, not the outside, who wakes up and first orients themselves toward their own values, their own purposes, their own assessments of what matters and what does not, and then moves into the external world from that grounded place, rather than being pulled by it. This is what mental strength actually means. It does not mean being unaffected by anything. Marcus Aurelius felt anger, he felt grief, he felt frustration and disappointment and loneliness. He writes about all of these things in his journal with remarkable honesty. He was not a stone. He was a deeply feeling human being. But his feelings did not govern him. He was moved, but he was not swept away. And the difference between being moved and being swept away is the inner citadel. How do you build it? Through several practices that the Stoics developed with extraordinary precision. The first practice is what Epictetus called prosoci attention, the practice of continuously watching your own mind, noticing what you are thinking, noticing what you are feeling, noticing what triggers you and what centers you, not to judge yourself, not to add another layer of criticism on top of whatever is already there, but simply to know yourself, to become intimately familiar with the terrain of your own inner world, because you cannot fortify a territory you have never mapped. Most people move through their entire lives without ever really examining what is happening inside them. They have reactions, strong ones, sometimes overwhelming ones, but they have never learned to step back and observe those reactions with any detachment. They are inside the storm, not watching it from the eye. Prosoci attention is the first stone in the inner citadel. It is the practice of learning to watch yourself think, to notice in real time when a thought is pulling you off center, when someone's opinion is beginning to affect your internal state, when you are drifting toward anxiety or resentment or the desperate hunger for approval, and simply noticing, simply seeing it is the beginning of freedom from it. The second practice is what the Stoics called hypomnemata, the keeping of notes, reflections, and philosophical reminders. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is the most famous example of this practice. He was not writing for an audience. He was writing to himself, reminding himself over and over of the truths he needed to live by. Truths like, people's opinions are not in your control. Truths like, your worth is not determined by external circumstances. Truths like, do what is right and release the results. Why did he need to remind himself over and over again? Because the world constantly pulls us away from these truths. Every single day brings new pressures, new social dynamics, new temptations to care about what we have decided not to care about. The inner citadel is not built once and then maintained automatically. It requires continuous maintenance, continuous renewal, continuous return. This is why journaling, keeping your own private record of your thoughts, your reflections, your struggles, and your returns to principle is such a powerful practice. It is not therapy. It is not self-obsession. It is the deliberate practice of staying grounded in what you have decided matters. The third practice is what the Stoics called melete meditation or contemplation, taking time regularly to sit quietly with your own mind, to rehearse your principles, to think through the difficult situations you are navigating and ask, what is the Stoic response here? What would a person of genuine wisdom and character do? And to prepare yourself, mentally and emotionally, for the challenges you know are coming. These three practices, attention, reflective writing, and contemplation, are the primary tools for building the inner citadel. And together, over time, they create something remarkable, a person who is genuinely harder to destabilize, whose peace is not contingent on external approval, whose sense of self does not collapse when someone attacks it, whose actions are driven by values rather than by the desire to be seen. This is what the Stoics call mental strength, not toughness in the sense of being hard or closed, but strength in the sense of being grounded, of having a center that holds. Chapter 5. Why the need for approval is destroying your life. Let us be honest about something. Most of the suffering in most people's lives is not caused by genuine hardship. It is caused by the gap between what they are and what they feel they need other people to believe they are. Read that again. The gap between what you are and what you feel you need other people to believe you are. This gap is the engine of enormous suffering. It is the engine of anxiety, of inauthenticity, of exhaustion, of the constant low-grade performance that characterizes most human social life. and it is driven by a single need, the need for approval. Now, approval seeking is not a character flaw. It is not a sign of weakness or stupidity. It is, at its root, a perfectly natural human response to a very real evolutionary pressure. Human beings are social animals. For hundreds of thousands of years, belonging to the group meant survival. Rejection from the group meant death. The psychological mechanisms that made our ancestors sensitive to social evaluation were not irrational, they were adaptive. But we are not living in that environment anymore, and the degree to which most of us are still running those ancient approval-seeking programs in a world where social rejection is no longer literally fatal is the degree to which we are operating on outdated software in a completely different world. The Stoics understood this in their own language, without the evolutionary psychology framework, with extraordinary clarity. Epictetus, who had been a slave, was in a uniquely powerful position to understand the difference between actual physical danger and the merely perceived danger of social disapproval. He had experienced actual oppression, actual powerlessness, and he came to understand, with the precision of someone who had been tested at the absolute limit, that the one thing that could never be taken from a human being was their capacity for rational self-governance. He wrote, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And what enslaves most people, what he observed enslaving the free Roman citizens around him far more comprehensively than his physical chains had ever enslaved him, was the need for approval. The need to be seen a certain way. The need to be liked, admired, respected, valued by others. Because when your sense of self-worth is located outside yourself, when it lives in other people's positive opinion of you, then your well-being is entirely dependent on something you cannot control. And you will spend every day of your life managing, performing, appealing, adjusting, and contorting yourself in the service of generating that external validation. This is not freedom. This is the most comprehensive possible form of slavery, because the chains are invisible and the jailer is inside your own mind. Let me give you a picture of what approval seeking actually costs. It costs you your authentic voice. When you are perpetually monitoring how your words will land, you cannot say what you actually think. You say what you think people want to hear, or what you think will generate the least friction, or what you think will make you look best. Your genuine perspective, the one that might actually be interesting, or challenging, or true, gets filtered out before it ever reaches expression. It costs you your decision-making. When your choices are constantly routed through the question of what will be approved of, you are not actually making your own choices. You are making the choices that the crowd around you, a crowd that changes, that contradicts itself, that has no unified opinion anyway, seems to prefer. You end up living a life that fits the expectations of others rather than the values of your own soul. It costs you your resilience. When your sense of okayness depends on approval, every disapproval is a crisis. Every criticism feels like an attack on your fundamental worth. Every failure becomes unbearable, not because of what it actually means about your capabilities, which is limited and temporary, but because of what it might mean about how you are perceived. And so you become someone who cannot take risks, cannot fail gracefully, cannot learn from mistakes without catastrophizing them, because every mistake is experienced as a potential verdict of unworthiness. It costs you your time, the mental energy spent managing your image, crafting social media posts, rehearsing conversations, replaying interactions and wondering how they landed, worrying about what someone thought about what you said. Adjusting your behavior based on perceived social signals is absolutely staggering when you add it up. How much of your actual life is being consumed by the project of managing your perceived life? It costs you your relationships. When you are performing for approval in your relationships, you are never actually meeting the other person. You are meeting their potential approval of you. And they are not meeting you, they are meeting your performance of you. Real intimacy, real connection requires the willingness to be seen honestly, without the performance. And the need for approval makes that terrifyingly difficult. The Stoics are not telling you to stop caring about people. They are not telling you to become indifferent to human connection. What they are telling you is that the approval-seeking behavior that most people mistake for caring is actually a distortion of caring. Real care for another person does not require their approval of you. Real respect for another person does not require their validation of your worth. You can care deeply, genuinely, actively, without needing their assessment of you to determine how you feel about yourself. In fact, that is the only way to truly care, because it is the only way to show up for another person without the hidden agenda of getting something back. Seneca wrote, "It is not that I am brave, it is that I know what is worth fearing, and what is worth fearing is not disapproval." What is worth fearing is the slow erosion of your own character through the endless accommodation of other people's expectations. Chapter 6. The Stoic Art of Strategic Indifference. Now we need to be careful, because ignoring people can be misunderstood. It can sound like a license for social coldness. It can sound like advice to become disconnected, dismissive, or arrogantly self-contained. And that would be a profound misreading of the Stoic tradition. The Stoics were not hermits. They were not misanthropes. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire of millions. Seneca was one of the most sophisticated social and political operators of his era. Epictetus ran a school and taught dozens of students. They were all deeply engaged with the human world. They all cared genuinely, actively about other people. But they practiced something I want to call strategic indifference. And strategic indifference is not the same as not caring about people. It is not caring about people's opinions of you in a way that disrupts your ability to act from your values. Let me make this concrete. Imagine someone criticizes you harshly and publicly. There are three possible responses. The first response is reactive. You feel the sting, you take it personally, your ego fires up, you defend yourself, you try to explain, you feel diminished, you replay it, you lose sleep over it, you adjust your future behavior to avoid similar attacks, and you carry the weight of it for days or weeks. This is the approval-dependent response. This is slavery. The second response is completely dismissive. You feel nothing. You don't register the criticism at all. You don't examine it for any possible validity. You simply discount it as irrelevant. This might look like strength, but it is actually another kind of rigidity. It closes you off from feedback that might genuinely help you grow, and it often comes from a defensive fragility rather than actual groundedness. The third response is strategic indifference. You hear the criticism. You do not immediately react with emotion. You create what the Stoics called a pause, a moment of distance between the stimulus and your response. In that pause, you ask, is this true? Is there anything here worth learning from? Is this person someone whose perspective deserves genuine consideration? And based on your answers, based on your clear-eyed, rational assessment, you decide what to do with it. If there is something valid, you take it in with genuine openness. If there is nothing valid, you release it completely, not with resentment or contempt, but simply with the understanding that it is not relevant to you. Strategic indifference is not the absence of discernment. It is discernment at its finest. It is the ability to evaluate what deserves your attention and what does not, without being at the mercy of your emotional reactions in making that evaluation. And it requires two things. First, it requires the self-knowledge to know the difference between your ego reacting to a threat and your wisdom responding to genuine feedback. Because these two things feel almost identical from the inside, and distinguishing between them takes real practice. Second, it requires what the Stoics called equanimity, a stable, grounded emotional baseline that does not spike dramatically in response to social inputs. When your baseline is stable, you can hear criticism without hearing it as an existential threat. You can receive praise without losing your head. You can remain essentially yourself regardless of the social weather. How do you build equanimity? This brings us back to the inner citadel. You build it through the practices we discussed: attention, reflection, contemplation. But it also involves something else: the deliberate practice of what the Stoics called negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum, premeditation of evils. This is one of the most underrated and misunderstood practices in the entire Stoic tradition. The idea is simple but powerful. Regularly imagine the difficult things that might happen to you. Imagine being criticized. Imagine being rejected. Imagine being misunderstood. Imagine being publicly humiliated. Not to torture yourself, not to create anxiety, but to prepare yourself. To pre-process the emotional weight of these scenarios so that when they actually occur, they do not land like lightning bolts. Seneca wrote, "Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." He meant, live with the constant awareness that difficult things are coming, so that when they arrive, you are not blindsided. When you have genuinely contemplated the possibility of being criticized, when you have sat with that scenario and worked through your responses to it in advance, the actual experience of being criticized has much less power over you. You have already been there in your mind, and you have already survived it. You know the territory. This is what Marcus Aurelius was doing when he wrote things like, "Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." He was not being cynical. He was preparing himself. He was conducting a daily premeditation of the social difficulties he knew he would encounter, so that when he encountered them, they could not destabilize him. Strategic indifference, then, is not distance from people. It is a specific way of being with people engaged, attentive, genuinely caring, without being at the mercy of their assessments of you. It is the ability to remain yourself in the company of people who would prefer you to be different. And once you develop this capacity, once you can walk into any room, any social situation, any conversation, with the inner stability to remain grounded in your own values and your own perspective, regardless of the social pressure around you, you discover something unexpected. You become far more genuinely present with people, not less, because you are no longer managing your performance. You are simply there. Chapter 7. Marcus Aurelius and the Difficult People. One of the most striking aspects of Marcus Aurelius's meditations is how frequently he writes about difficult people. For someone who held the most powerful position in the Roman Empire, he spent a remarkable amount of his private philosophical reflection grappling with the basic human challenge of dealing with people who are petty, dishonest, ungrateful, or cruel. He writes about people who lie to him, people who exploit his generosity, people who act against their own good sense, people who are driven entirely by appetite and vanity, people who work against everything he is trying to accomplish. And he returns again and again to the same resolution: to remain unmoved, to respond with patience, with reason, with genuine goodwill, and without expectation. His method is worth examining in detail because it is extraordinarily practical. First, Marcus Aurelius consistently returns to the reminder that difficult people are not choosing to be difficult in any deep sense. He writes that no one acts wrongly on purpose, that every person, from within their own perspective and their own understanding, is doing what they believe is best or necessary or right. This is not naivety. It is a philosophical position borrowed from Socrates, that all wrongdoing is a form of ignorance, that the person who lies or cheats or manipulates is, at the most fundamental level, someone who has not understood something important about ethics, about the nature of human flourishing, about what actually makes a life worth living. This understanding does not excuse the wrongdoing. It does not mean you accept it passively or fail to respond to it. but it changes your emotional relationship to it. When you understand that the person causing you difficulty is operating from a form of ignorance, from a diminished perspective, from a wounded inner world, you stop taking their behavior as a personal verdict. You stop experiencing their cruelty as something that is about you. It is about them. It is about whatever has made them the way they are. And while that does not make it pleasant, it makes it far less devastating. Second, Marcus Aurelius returns constantly to the reminder that all human beings share a common nature. He was deeply influenced by the Stoic cosmopolitanism, the idea that every human being, regardless of their social status, their nationality, their behavior, participates in the same rational nature. That at some fundamental level, even the most difficult person you encounter is your kin, not your enemy. Your kin, he writes. We are made for cooperation, like feet, like hands, like eyelids, like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. To act against one another, then, is contrary to nature. Now, this does not mean you cooperate with everyone blindly. It does not mean you allow harmful people unlimited access to your life. But it means you never lose your basic goodwill toward human beings as a species. You never allow the behavior of specific difficult individuals to poison your general orientation toward humanity. Third, and this is perhaps the most practical element of his approach, Marcus Aurelius relentlessly reminds himself that other people's behavior, no matter how egregious, is not actually capable of harming what matters most in him. He writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And he writes that the only real harm that can come to you is the harm you do to your own character, the harm of responding badly, of losing your virtue, of acting in a way inconsistent with who you have decided to be. This is an enormously powerful reframe, because it shifts the entire question from, how do I stop this person from affecting me, to, how do I ensure that my response to this person reflects who I am? The first question is impossible to answer in any satisfying way, because you cannot control other people. The second question is entirely answerable, because your response is one of the things that is completely in your control. When someone is rude to you, the question is not, how do I make them stop being rude? Or how do I make them feel bad about being rude? Or how do I get validation from someone else about how rude they were? The question is, what is the response that reflects the person I am committed to being? Sometimes that response is firm and direct. Sometimes it is patient and understanding. Sometimes it is simply to walk away and give no energy to what does not deserve energy. But it is always chosen from your values, chosen from your character rather than simply reactive. And here is the thing that Marcus Aurelius understood, and that you must understand too. When you respond from your character rather than from your reaction, something extraordinary happens to your relationship with difficult people. They lose their power over you, not because you become cold or indifferent, but because your internal state is no longer at their mercy. They can be as difficult as they want. They cannot make you be less than yourself. That is the ultimate protection against difficult people. Not avoiding them because you cannot avoid them entirely, and trying to do so makes you a prisoner of avoidance. Not fighting them because fighting them just extends the energy exchange indefinitely, but simply remaining yourself with such groundedness and consistency that their behavior finds no purchase in you. Chapter 8. Silence as Power. The Stoic practice of not explaining yourself. There is a practice that sounds simple and is extraordinarily difficult. It is the practice of not explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think. Let me repeat that. Not explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think. Most of us spend enormous energy trying to get people to understand us. And often, this is completely reasonable. Communication is important. Clarity matters. And the effort to be understood is a meaningful form of connection. But there is a specific situation in which the effort to explain yourself is not just futile, but actively counterproductive. And that situation is when the person you are explaining yourself to has already made up their mind. You know this person. You have met them in many forms. They might be the family member who has decided you are selfish and who interprets every action you take, including genuinely selfless ones, as further evidence of selfishness. They might be the colleague who has decided you are incompetent and who frames every success you have as luck and every mistake you make as confirmation. They might be the social media commenter who has decided you are wrong and who has no genuine interest in your response except as material for their next counterattack. With these people, explanation is not a path to understanding. It is an extended surrender, because every explanation you offer is interpreted through the lens of the conclusion they have already reached and either dismissed or repurposed as more ammunition. And the very act of explaining yourself, the very desire to make them understand, to win them over, to correct their misperception, signals to them that their opinion of you matters enormously to you, which gives them power over you. The Stoic practice of silence is not sulking. It is not passive aggression. It is not the cold shoulder. It is the deliberate choice to conserve your energy, specifically your explanatory defensive energy, for contexts where it can actually do something productive. Seneca wrote, "Retire into yourself as much as possible." He was not advising social withdrawal. He was advising a kind of internal sovereignty, the practice of not giving everyone who comes along an invitation into the inner workings of your motivation and your identity. There is a freedom in not explaining yourself to people who don't deserve the explanation. It is the freedom of recognizing that your worth is not contingent on their understanding, that you do not need to convince them, that their misperception of you, while perhaps uncomfortable, does not change who you actually are. Think of the specific people in your life, the critics, the skeptics, the people who judge harshly and without real knowledge, and notice how much energy you spend composing responses to them, how much mental real estate they occupy, how often you find yourself rehearsing explanations for choices you made, defenses against criticisms they leveled, justifications for who you are and what you do. Now ask yourself, what would it feel like to simply stop, to simply let your actions speak over time without the constant verbal scaffolding of explanation and defense? To allow the people who are willing to see clearly and to accept with genuine equanimity that some people will never see you clearly regardless of how much you explain. Marcus Aurelius almost never defended himself publicly. He was one of the most criticized emperors in Roman history, criticized for being too philosophical, too gentle, too invested in abstract virtue, and he essentially refused to engage with those criticisms directly. He simply continued doing what he believed was right, as well as he possibly could, and trusted that his actions would constitute the only real statement worth making. This is not arrogance. This is confidence, specifically the confidence that comes from genuinely knowing your own values and trusting them. Arrogant silence is the silence of someone who believes they are above criticism. Stoic silence is the silence of someone who has examined the criticism, found it either valid or not, dealt with it internally, and moved on without needing to convert the critic. The next time someone misunderstands you, the next time someone judges you unfairly, makes an assumption about your motives, or criticizes a choice you made thoughtfully before you reach for the explanation, try the pause. Try asking yourself, is this person actually open to understanding, or have they already decided? And if they have already decided, ask yourself, what do I gain from explaining? And more importantly, what do I lose? Because what you often lose in the exhausting, often fruitless project of making the closed-minded understand is your time, your energy, your dignity, and your peace. Chapter 9. The Social Media Trap and the Stoic Response. We cannot have this conversation honestly without talking about the specific, unprecedented challenge of social media, because nothing in human history has created a more perfectly designed engine for approval-seeking, social comparison, and the anxious management of other people's perceptions than the platforms we carry around in our pockets. Social media did not invent approval-seeking, but it industrialized it. It created a system that quantifies social approval in likes, in followers, in comments, and delivers it in unpredictable, intermittent doses, which is the precise reinforcement schedule that creates the strongest possible behavioral conditioning. Every slot machine in every casino works on the same principle: unpredictable rewards at irregular intervals. And we have built that mechanism into devices that we check 50 times a day. The consequence is that millions of people are now living their lives as a continuous performance for an audience. Experiences are filtered through the question of how they will appear online before they are fully felt. Opinions are calibrated for maximum social approval before they are fully formed. Identity itself is increasingly constructed around an online persona, a carefully curated collection of images and statements designed to generate positive response rather than around genuinely held values. The Stoics could not have anticipated Instagram, but they would have recognized the pattern immediately. They would have called it what it is: a powerful external force trying to pull you away from your own center and toward the perpetual management of social appearance. And their response would have been the same as it always is: return to the dichotomy of control. What is in your control? What you post, what you choose to engage with, how much time you give to these platforms, how you interpret the response you receive. What is not in your control? How many people like what you post? What people say about you online? Whether your content goes viral or disappears into silence, whether your audience grows or shrinks. Once you see this clearly, the anxiety around social media begins to dissolve, because anxiety is always about the uncontrollable. When you are anxious about your number of followers, you are anxious about something you cannot directly control, which means your anxiety is entirely self-generated, suffering with no productive purpose. What would a Stoic approach to social media look like? It would look like using these platforms as tools rather than as mirrors. A tool is something you pick up to accomplish a specific purpose and put down when the purpose is served. A mirror is something you constantly return to, checking how you appear, hoping you look okay. Using social media as a tool means, I have a specific purpose here: sharing ideas, building community, reaching people who might benefit from what I create, and I will engage with these platforms in service of that purpose. When I check my metrics, I will use that data to understand what is resonating and what is not, and I will adjust accordingly. But I will not allow that data to become a judgment on my worth. A low engagement number is information. It is not a verdict. Using social media as a mirror means I post and then wait anxiously. The likes validate me. The lack of likes diminishes me. The comments become a landscape of tiny approvals and disapprovals that I navigate with constant tension, and I spend more and more of my actual life in service of the performance of my life online. The Stoic approach requires a deliberate, conscious choice to use these platforms differently. It requires the discipline to set aside your phone at specific times, to check your metrics with genuine curiosity rather than emotional investment, to create content from a place of genuine desire, to contribute something useful rather than from the hunger to be approved of. To remember, every single time you open these apps, that the response you receive, whatever it is, exists entirely outside your inner citadel and cannot touch what matters most. And perhaps most importantly, it requires the courage to be genuinely yourself online, to say what you actually think, to share what you actually believe, to be authentic enough that the people who resonate will resonate deeply, even if that means the people who don't resonate will scroll past or push back. Because the most powerful presence on any platform is not the most optimized one, it is the most real one. Chapter 10. Amor Fati, loving what is, including difficult people. There is a phrase in Stoic philosophy, particularly in the later Stoicism, shaped by Marcus Aurelius, and the ideas that Friedrich Nietzsche later borrowed and amplified, that is perhaps the most radical of all the Stoic ideas. The phrase is Amor Fati, love of fate, not acceptance of fate, not grudging tolerance of fate, love of fate, the active, engaged, genuine embrace of everything that happens to you, including the difficult parts, including the parts that hurt, including the people who challenge you, betray you, misunderstand you, treat you badly. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Accept the things to which fate binds you, and love the people with whom fate brings you together, and do so with all your heart." Now, this seems paradoxical in the context of a video about the power of ignoring people. If we are talking about releasing our dependence on other people's opinions, about building a mind that cannot be destabilized by external forces, how does that square with loving everything, including the people who cause us difficulty? Here is the resolution. Amor Fati is not a practice of passive acceptance or naive sentimentality. It is a practice of radical willingness, the choice to see everything that happens, including the most difficult things, as part of your path rather than as obstacles to your path. When someone treats you badly, the reactive mind says, "This is wrong. This should not be happening. This person has damaged me. This situation is getting in the way of my well-being." And the suffering that follows is not just the pain of the difficult experience itself, it is the additional suffering of resistance to that experience. The suffering of the belief that things should be different than they are. Amor Fati says, this is exactly what is happening. This person, this situation, this difficulty, this is what fate has brought to your door today. And the question is not how to get rid of it or how to resist it, but what you can make of it, what it can teach you, how your response to it can express and develop your character. This is not the same as saying that difficult people are fine, that cruelty is acceptable, that you should welcome being mistreated. It is saying that the moment of difficulty, once it has arrived, is now part of your reality, and fighting the reality of your reality is a guaranteed path to suffering. The Stoics believe that everything that happens, including the most apparently negative things, contains within it the material for virtue. The person who insults you gives you the opportunity to practice patience and equanimity. The colleague who undermines you gives you the opportunity to practice groundedness and self-confidence, independent of external validation. The friend who disappoints you gives you the opportunity to practice forgiveness and realistic expectations. This is not forced positivity. This is not the self-help cliché of everything happens for a reason in some cosmic sense. This is something more practical and more honest. The recognition that every situation, however difficult, contains within it the possibility of a response that is genuinely virtuous, and that choosing that response, choosing to grow through what happens rather than being diminished by it, is what life is actually for. When you develop Amor Fati in relation to other people, when you genuinely begin to embrace the reality of the people in your life, including the difficult ones, as part of the specific human experience that has been given to you, something unexpected happens to your need to ignore people. The need itself begins to dissolve because you are no longer trying to protect yourself from reality. You are no longer curating your experience to include only the pleasant parts. You are engaging with all of it, openly, courageously, with your whole self. And from that engagement, you are growing in ways that the protected, defended, carefully curated self never could. Chapter 11. The Critics, the Haters, and the Envious: A Stoic Field Guide. Let us get specific about the categories of difficult people the Stoics wrote about, because they are remarkably consistent with what we encounter in modern life. The specific historical details change. The fundamental human patterns do not. The first category is the critic. The critic is someone who judges your work, your choices, your character, often without the full context, often without genuine expertise, and often from a position of some personal interest in seeing you diminished. Critics exist in every domain of life, in your professional world, in your family, in your social circle, and in the vast anonymous terrain of the internet. The Stoic approach to critics is not defensive and not dismissive. It is discerning. The question Epictetus asks is not who is criticizing me, but is the criticism valid? If a skilled person who understands your domain and has examined your work carefully points out a genuine error, that criticism is gold. Take it, thank the critic genuinely, and use it to grow. If an unskilled person who has barely examined your work makes a sweeping judgment based on a superficial impression, their criticism contains no useful information. Register it, check for any kernel of truth, and release it. The key discipline is separating the content of the criticism from the emotional charge it carries. Because criticism, even completely unfounded criticism, can sting, and the sting can make you want to either defend yourself or dismiss the criticism entirely. Both reactions prevent you from actually examining it clearly. The Stoic practice is to allow the sting, recognize it as a response in your nervous system rather than a signal about the validity of the criticism, and then examine the criticism on its merits with as much calm as you can muster. The second category is the hater. The hater is different from the critic. The critic, at least in principle, is oriented toward truth, toward what is actually wrong with what you are doing. The hater is oriented toward something else entirely, the emotion of hostility itself, or the relief of displacing their own dissatisfaction onto a target. Haters, and this is worth understanding clearly, are not actually about you. They are about their own internal experience. The person who goes out of their way to express contempt for something you have created, or something you have said, or something you are, that person is almost always operating from a place of personal pain. Often envy, which we will get to. Often the frustration of their own unfulfilled potential. Often the discomfort of seeing someone else doing what they wish they were doing. Marcus Aurelius wrote that when someone does you wrong, you should look for whatever good understanding you might have of them, and find within yourself pity rather than anger. Not because pity feels good, and not because it is particularly satisfying in the moment, but because it is accurate. The person who works to tear down what you are building is, at the root, someone who is suffering. Their hostility is a symptom, not a verdict. This does not mean you give them your time or your energy or your emotional investment, but it means you do not meet their energy with matching anger. Because anger is exactly what they want. It is what makes them feel powerful. The most devastating response to a hater is complete equanimity. Not cold contempt, that is still a form of giving them power. True equanimity, the genuine absence of disturbance. The communication through your unruffled continuation of your work that their hostility simply does not register as significant. The third category is the envious person. Envy is one of the most painful emotions in the human repertoire, and people who are in the grip of it are some of the most destructive forces you will encounter in your social world. The envious person wants what you have, or what they perceive you to have: your success, your talent, your relationships, your confidence, your peace, and because they want it and cannot get it through their own effort, they attempt to get it through the next best thing: destruction. If they cannot have what you have, perhaps they can take it from you. Or take it from you in the social perception, undermine your reputation, spread doubt about your capabilities, minimize your achievements, frame your success as luck or as something unfair or as something that doesn't count. If your standing can be reduced to their level, the discomfort of the envy is temporarily relieved. Seneca wrote about envy with piercing clarity. He observed that the envious person suffers doubly, first from whatever lack they feel in themselves, and second from the success they see in another. He called this a peculiar kind of torture, to be made miserable by the good fortune of others. The Stoic approach to the envious person involves two things. First, genuine compassion, because envy is genuinely terrible to experience, and the person in its grip is suffering. Second, clear boundaries around the amount of access they have to your life, because envy consistently produces destructive behavior. You can feel compassion for someone's suffering while simultaneously recognizing that their proximity to you is damaging. The fourth category is the indifferent person. This might seem like the easiest to deal with, but for many people, indifference is actually the most painful. The person who doesn't care about what you do, who is unimpressed, unmoved, inattentive, can sting in ways that active criticism cannot. Because we naturally interpret indifference as a judgment, this person has looked at what I am doing and found it not worth their attention. But the Stoic response to indifference is clear and simple. Other people's attention is not yours to command, and it is not a measure of your worth. Marcus Aurelius was entirely clear on this. He wrote about how briefly our lives last, and how quickly the names and works of even the greatest people fade from memory. He used this not to create despair, but to create freedom. If fame is temporary, then the absence of fame is not a failure. If attention is fleeting, then the lack of attention is not a verdict. Do your work because it is worth doing. Create because creating is valuable in itself. Build because building matters, not because the specific people in front of you right now are paying attention. Their attention or inattention tells you something about them, and perhaps something about how effectively you are communicating, but it tells you nothing about whether what you are doing is genuinely worth doing. Chapter 12. The Practice of Self-Control. Mastering the Inner Response. Everything we have discussed so far comes down to one central skill: self-control. Not in the popular sense of white-knuckling your way through temptation, but in the Stoic sense of governing your inner response specifically, governing the gap between what happens to you and how you respond. The Stoics called this space the hegemonikon, the ruling part of the mind, the part that decides what to do with incoming impressions. Every time something happens to you, every time someone says something to you, does something to you, or thinks something about you that reaches your awareness, your hegemonikon has a choice. It can react automatically, driven by instinct and conditioning, or it can pause, evaluate, and respond deliberately. Epictetus was obsessed with this capacity. He returned to it constantly in his teachings. He insisted that the discipline of how you respond to external impressions is not just a philosophical nicety, it is the foundation of everything. Because if you cannot govern your responses, then you are governed by them. And if you are governed by your automatic reactions, then you are not really making choices at all. You are just an elaborate machine executing programs you did not consciously install. The Stoic practice of self-control in response to other people involves several specific exercises. The first is the pause. Before you respond to anything that provokes you, any comment, any criticism, any social dynamic that triggers an emotional reaction, insert a deliberate pause. In ancient Stoic practice, this was sometimes described as remembering to take a breath, not a metaphorical breath, an actual physical breath. The act of breathing slowly and deliberately activates your parasympathetic nervous system and creates a small amount of physiological space between stimulus and response. In that space, however small, you can ask, what is actually happening here? What am I feeling? What is driving that feeling? What response would best reflect who I am trying to be? This practice sounds simple. It is deceptively difficult in the moments when it matters most, the moments when your ego is stinging, when your anger is activated, when your anxiety is firing. But with practice, the pause becomes more accessible. The space between stimulus and response gradually widens, and you begin to experience something that the Stoics described as the most fundamental form of freedom: genuine choice in how you respond to your life. The second practice is what I call the reframe check. When something happens that provokes you, particularly when someone's behavior triggers a strong emotional response, the Stoic practice is to actively examine the story you are telling yourself about it. Because our emotional reactions are almost never responses to bare facts. They are responses to interpretations of facts. Someone doesn't respond to your message. The bare fact is that you sent a message and have not received a reply. The interpretation, the story you tell about that bare fact is where your emotional response comes from. Perhaps you tell yourself, "They are ignoring me. They are angry with me. They don't care about me. They think I am not worth their time." Each of these interpretations produces a different emotional response, and none of them may be accurate. The reframe check asks, is this the only way to interpret what is happening? What are the other possible interpretations? Which interpretations are supported by actual evidence? And which interpretation would a wise, grounded, equanimous person adopt in this situation? Often, the most emotionally charged interpretation is the least accurate one. And the act of systematically examining your interpretations, questioning your stories, creates a tremendous amount of freedom from unnecessary suffering. The third practice is what Epictetus called assent, the deliberate choice of which impressions to give your agreement to, because not every thought that arises in your mind is something you have to believe. Not every emotional impulse is something you have to act on. Not every impression that comes flying at you from your own psychology, from the social world around you, deserves your assent. When someone's criticism lands and your mind immediately produces the thought, "They're right, I'm not good enough," that thought is an impression. It is not necessarily true, and you have a choice about whether to assent to it, to agree with it, to make it part of your self-concept, or whether to examine it carefully and, if it doesn't hold up, to decline to give it your agreement. This is self-control at the most fundamental level. Not just control of your behavior, but control of what you believe, what you identify with, what you allow to define you. And the Stoics insist that this control is available to every human being, regardless of their circumstances. Epictetus was a slave, and he exercised it. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and later articulated ideas remarkably consistent with Stoic philosophy, exercised it in conditions almost inconceivably more extreme than anything most of us will ever face. And they both arrived at the same fundamental truth, that the last freedom, the ultimate, unassailable freedom, is the freedom to choose how you respond to what happens to you. That freedom is yours. The practice of Stoicism is the practice of actualizing it. Chapter 13. Building relationships from strength, not need. We have talked at length about releasing the need for approval, but I want to address something important. The goal is not to become someone who does not need people. Human beings are social creatures. We need connection. We need belonging. We need love. These are not weaknesses to be overcome. They are fundamental aspects of human nature that the Stoics themselves honored deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "What injures the hive injures the bee." He believed that human beings are meant to cooperate, to care for one another, to contribute to the common good. He did not envision Stoic wisdom as a path to isolated self-sufficiency. The Stoic goal is not to eliminate your need for people. It is to transform your relationship with that need to move from relating to people from a place of anxiety and dependence to relating to them from a place of genuine strength and genuine choice. There is a profound difference between needing people and choosing people. When you need people in the approval-dependent sense, when your sense of worth depends on their validation, when your well-being is contingent on their positive regard, then your relationships are fundamentally transactional, even when they feel intimate, because beneath every interaction is a hidden exchange. I will behave in ways you approve of, and in return you will give me the validation I need. This is not connection. This is negotiation. When you choose people from a place of strength, when your sense of worth is internally grounded and not contingent on their approval, then your relationships can be genuinely free. You can be with people because you genuinely enjoy them, genuinely care for them, genuinely find value in the connection. You can love without the desperate hunger for that love to be returned in exactly the right proportion. You can give without the concealed expectation of receiving. You can be honest without the fear that honesty will cost you the relationship. This is what Stoicism offers to your relationships. Not less connection, but more authentic connection. Not fewer relationships, but relationships that are actually real, where you are actually showing up as yourself rather than as a performance designed for approval. Seneca wrote, "Associate with those who will make a better person of you." This is not about being selective in a snobbish sense. It is about being intentional, about recognizing that the people you surround yourself with shape you, and that choosing them thoughtfully, choosing people whose character you admire, whose honesty you trust, whose company helps you become more of who you are trying to be, is a fundamental act of wisdom. And equally, it is about having the Stoic courage to be less influenced by people who pull you away from your values. Not necessarily to cut them off entirely. The Stoics were generally opposed to dramatic social gestures, but to maintain your own center in their presence, to genuinely care for them while refusing to be shaped by them. The people worth having in your life in depth are the ones who can handle your authentic self, the ones who stay when you are honest, the ones who disagree with you directly rather than quietly withdrawing their approval, the ones whose acceptance of you is not contingent on you performing a particular version of yourself. These people are rare. They are worth seeking and worth keeping, and you can only find them and keep them if you are willing to show up as yourself, even at the risk of losing the approval of people who only want the performance. Chapter 14. The Long Game. Why Virtue is Its Own Reward. We are approaching the final chapters of this conversation, and I want to bring everything back to the central claim of Stoic philosophy, the claim that is most radical, most countercultural, and most deeply true. The claim is this: virtue is its own reward. Not in a trite way, not as a consolation prize for people who don't get the external rewards they wanted, but in the deepest possible sense, a life lived according to genuine virtue, with wisdom, with justice, with courage, with self-control, is the best possible life available to a human being. Not despite the absence of external approval, not in some future accounting where the virtuous are finally recognized. Right now, in the living of it. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." And Epictetus wrote, "He is a wise man who does not grieve for the things which he has not, but rejoices for those which he has." These are not statements of resignation. They are statements of liberation, because what they point to is a life that is fundamentally secure, not because everything goes well externally, but because your sense of your own worth and your own happiness is anchored in something that external circumstances cannot touch. When you live according to virtue, when every day you are genuinely trying to be wiser, more just, more courageous, more self-controlled than you were the day before, you accumulate something that no one can take from you and that requires no external validation to be real. You accumulate character, and character, the Stoics believed, is the only real wealth. Money can be lost, fame can be reversed, relationships can end, health can fail. But the character you build through years of disciplined effort, through the 1,000 small choices to do the harder, better thing that is yours in a way that nothing external ever can be. And here is the deep connection to ignoring people. When you are living the long game of virtue, when your primary orientation is toward becoming better rather than toward being seen as good, the opinions of others simply become less important. Not because you are trying to be indifferent, but because you have something more important to pay attention to. The person who is constantly monitoring the social thermometer does not have enough attention left over for their own actual work. The person who is perpetually anxious about how they are perceived cannot fully inhabit the present moment, because part of them is always in the imagined minds of observers. But the person who is genuinely focused on becoming excellent in whatever domain they have committed to is too absorbed in the real work to be significantly distracted by the ambient noise of social judgment. This is not the cold, strategic indifference of someone who has decided other people don't matter. It is the organic, natural indifference of someone who is so genuinely engaged with what matters that there is simply not much space left over for what doesn't. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, described a kind of freedom that comes from this clarity. If you want to be free, you must not desire many things. Most men let things take the lead, and things become their master. He was talking about material things, but the principle extends to social things, to approval, to recognition, to the constant accumulation of positive regard. When you genuinely release the desire for these things, not as a performance of indifference, but as a genuine recognition that they are not where the best life lives, something opens up, a kind of spaciousness, a kind of ease. You are no longer fighting for something. You are no longer defending something. You are simply living fully, presently, committedly in the direction of what you genuinely believe is worth living for. That is the long game, and it is the only game worth playing. Chapter 15. Practical Stoic Exercises for Building Mental Strength. Let us now get very practical. Because Stoicism is not meant to live only in philosophy books and YouTube videos. It is meant to be practiced daily, deliberately, in the actual texture of your actual life. Here are the specific practices that will help you build the mental strength and self-control we have been discussing. These are not my inventions. They are drawn directly from the ancient Stoic tradition, adapted for the reality of the world you are actually living in. The first practice is the morning journal. Before you engage with any external input, before you check your phone, before you open social media, before you read news or messages, take 10 minutes to write. Write about what you are facing today. Write about the specific challenges and difficulties you anticipate. Write about who you want to be in those situations. Write out the core Stoic principles that are most relevant to what you are navigating. Write as if you are talking to yourself, not performing, not polishing, just thinking on paper. Marcus Aurelius did this. His Meditations is the accumulated record of his morning practice over years and years. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing to remind himself, day after day, of who he was trying to be. You can do the same. And over time, the practice of returning to your values in writing every morning creates a kind of gravitational pull toward those values throughout the day. The second practice is the evening review. At the end of each day, before you sleep, take 5 minutes to review the day honestly. Ask 3 questions. Where did I fall short of who I am trying to be? Where did I succeed? What can I do differently tomorrow? The Pythagoreans, whose influence on Stoicism was significant, conducted this same kind of review, asking themselves, where did I go wrong? What did I accomplish? What did I leave undone? The goal is not self-punishment. It is the honest, consistent accounting that allows genuine growth. Without this review, the lessons of each day evaporate. With it, each day becomes a genuine increment in your development. The third practice is voluntary discomfort. The Stoics believed that deliberately placing yourself in uncomfortable situations, not dangerous ones, but ones that challenge your comfort, trains your character in ways that ease simply cannot. Epictetus recommended occasionally eating less than you could. Seneca famously wrote about deliberately dressing as a poor person for days at a time, eating simple food, sleeping on hard surfaces. Not because poverty is desirable, but because experiencing it voluntarily builds the inner knowledge that you can survive discomfort and that your well-being does not actually depend on comfort. In the context of social approval, voluntary discomfort might look like speaking honestly in a social situation where the honest thing is unpopular, doing something publicly that you believe in but that you know will not generate approval, declining to laugh at a joke you don't find funny because everyone else is laughing, expressing a genuine opinion instead of the expected one. These small acts of social nonconformity, done from values rather than from rebellion, build the muscle of independent judgment. The fourth practice is the view from above. This is a meditation technique the Stoics use to gain perspective. Close your eyes and imagine yourself rising above your current situation, above your room, above your city, above the earth itself, and looking down at the tiny specifics of what you are currently worried about. The opinion of this particular person in this particular moment, the social dynamic in this specific context. And then ask yourself, from this perspective, how significant is this? In the context of human history, in the context of the cosmos, in the context of the countless billions of people who have lived and struggled and cared deeply about things that have since been completely forgotten, how much does this specific social situation actually matter? This is not nihilism, this is perspective. And perspective, genuine, deeply felt perspective, is one of the most powerful antidotes to the exaggerated importance we assign to social opinion in the heat of the moment. The fifth practice is premeditation of difficult people. Before you enter any social situation that you know will be challenging, a meeting with someone who criticizes you, a family gathering with someone who tends to provoke you, a conversation that you know might become difficult, take a few minutes to prepare mentally. Imagine the specific difficulties that might arise. Imagine how you want to respond. Rehearse your Stoic response. The pause, the equanimity, the action from your values rather than from your reactions. This is not pessimistic thinking. It is preparation. An athlete prepares for the hardest conditions they might face. A surgeon prepares for complications. A soldier prepares for unexpected challenges. Why would you not prepare for the social situations you already know will test you? The sixth practice is the philosophy of enough. Seneca wrote, "The man who has no limit to his desires has no limit to his dissatisfaction." And in the specific context of approval, this means decide deliberately how much approval you need and then stop at that point. Notice when approval seeking is pulling you beyond your genuine needs, beyond the reasonable desire for human connection and honest feedback, into the compulsive accumulation of validation. And practice stopping. Practice saying internally, "This is enough. I am enough. I don't need more." The seventh practice, and perhaps the most important, is the return. Every practice I have described will fail at some point. You will be provoked beyond your preparation. You will react instead of respond. You will fall into approval seeking even though you know better. You will lose your center in the grip of someone else's opinion. This is guaranteed because you are human. The Stoic practice is not perfection. It is the return. The practice of noticing when you have drifted from your center without excessive self-criticism, without prolonged self-flagellation, and simply returning again and again and again, as many times as it takes, because each return reinforces the path. Each return makes the next return a little easier. And over a lifetime of deliberate, committed, imperfect returning to your values, that is what character is. That is what genuine mental strength looks like. Chapter 16. When ignoring people becomes your superpower. We are approaching the end of this conversation, and I want to bring you to the destination. Because everything we have discussed, the dichotomy of control, the inner citadel, the release of approval seeking, the practice of strategic indifference, the long game of virtue, all of it is building towards something specific, something that, once you genuinely develop it, changes your entire experience of being alive. When you stop needing other people's approval to feel okay, when you have genuinely, not just philosophically but experientially, relocated your sense of worth from the external world to the internal world, something extraordinary happens to your capacities. Your decision-making improves dramatically because you are no longer routing your choices through the question of what will be approved of. You are free to think clearly about what is actually right, what you actually believe, What is actually consistent with your values and your vision for your life? Your decisions become your own, genuinely your own, in a way they cannot be when they are constantly filtered through the anticipated reactions of others. Your creativity expands. Creativity is essentially killed by the constant monitoring of social approval. Because genuinely creative work that comes from somewhere original, somewhere true, is almost by definition work that will not be universally approved of. It will challenge some people, confuse others, provoke others, and if you are in the grip of approval seeking, you will sand down every rough and original edge in the pursuit of mass acceptability and end up with something smooth and forgettable. When you stop needing approval, you can create freely, fully, honestly, with whatever strange specificity actually lives in you. And that is where genuinely remarkable work comes from. Your communication becomes more powerful. There is nothing more compelling than someone who is saying what they actually think. Someone who is not managing your impression of them, who is not calculating the social impact of each word, but simply speaking directly from their genuine perspective. These people are rare, and they draw others to them, not because they are trying to be impressive, but because they are being real. And realness, genuine, unperformed realness, is magnetic in a world where almost everyone is performing almost all the time. Your relationships deepen. As we discussed, when you release the need for approval, you create the conditions for genuine intimacy. Because you can now show up honestly, and honest presence, the willingness to be actually seen, is what deep relationships are built from. The relationships you cultivate from this place of genuine freedom are fundamentally different in quality from those you maintained through performance. They are fewer, perhaps, but they are real. Your resilience becomes remarkable. When you are not dependent on external approval for your sense of well-being, the fluctuations of the external world have much less power to devastate you. Bad days are still bad. Failures still sting, losses still hurt, but they do not knock you out. They do not require extended recovery because they have not touched what is most fundamental in you, your sense of your own worth, your sense of your own direction, your sense of who you are. And perhaps most importantly, your energy becomes available for what matters. All of the energy that previously went into monitoring the social environment, managing perceptions, anxiously tracking who thinks what about you, performing for audiences real and imagined, all of that energy becomes available for your work, for your relationships, for your own growth, for the things you actually care about. The difference in available, creative, and emotional energy is staggering. It is, quite literally, as if you had been carrying a backpack full of rocks everywhere you went, and you have finally set it down. This is not a fantasy. This is not an unattainable ideal for extraordinary people. This is a specific, achievable state of being that results from specific, learnable practices, applied with genuine commitment over real time. Marcus Aurelius got there imperfectly, with daily effort, by continuous return. Epictetus got there from a condition of literal slavery, through philosophy and disciplined practice. Seneca got there through years of exile, loss, and the constant challenge of living his values in a world that did not always reward it. You can get there too, not because you are extraordinary though you may be, but because the path is clear and it has been walked before. Chapter 17. A letter to those who have been wounded by words. Before we close, I want to speak directly to you, specifically to those of you who came to this video not just as curious learners, but as people who are genuinely hurting. People who have been deeply wounded by what others have said about them or done to them. People whose trust has been broken, whose confidence has been shaken, who lie awake at night turning over words that someone said to them, sometimes recently, sometimes years ago, that they simply cannot get free of. If that is you, I want you to hear this. The words that wounded you were not about you. They were about the person who said them. They were expressions of that person's pain, that person's limitations, that person's fear, that person's inability to handle what they saw in you. This does not make them hurt less, but it is true. And truth, even when it is painful, is always the beginning of healing. The Stoics did not promise that nothing would ever hurt. Marcus Aurelius was hurt deeply, repeatedly. He lost children. He was betrayed by people he trusted. He governed through plagues and wars and the constant grinding cruelty of political life. He felt these things. He wrote about them with the raw honesty of someone who is not pretending to be above suffering. But he came back. Every single time, he came back to the same practice. This is what happened. This is real. Now, what is the response that reflects who I am? What is the next right action? Not because he was made of stone, because he had built something slowly, imperfectly, with daily effort that the world's cruelties could not ultimately destroy. He had built an inner life that was genuinely his own, a set of values that belonged to no one but him, a practice of return that brought him home to himself no matter how far the storms drove him. You can do the same. You are doing the same, perhaps, simply by being here, by seeking out these ideas, by sitting with this conversation for this long. The wounds do not define you. Other people's opinions do not define you. What someone said about you in a moment of cruelty or confusion or small-mindedness, none of it defines you. You define you through the choices you make about who to be, how to respond, what to pursue, what to let go of. And the fact that you are here seeking wisdom, seeking to understand, seeking to grow, tells me something important about you. It tells me that you have not given up, that beneath whatever wounds have been inflicted, your essential self is still intact, still searching, still reaching for something better. That reaching is everything. That reaching is the inner citadel under construction. And every day you practice, every day you choose to return to your values rather than be defined by what has been done to you, you are adding a stone. Keep building. Chapter 18. Putting it all together, the Stoic way of moving through the world. Let us bring everything together into a picture of what this looks like in practice. What does a person who has genuinely internalized these ideas actually look like, moving through the world? They do not walk around with their chin up in performative confidence, broadcasting their indifference to other people's opinions. That is a performance still audience-dependent, still about how it looks from the outside. Real Stoic indifference is quiet. It is internal. It barely shows. What shows instead is presence. The person who has genuinely released the need for approval is almost always genuinely present in whatever situation they are in, because they are not spending half their attention managing their image. They are simply here, fully, attentively, openly here. What shows is directness. They say what they think clearly, kindly, without the excessive hedging and qualification that comes from the fear of giving offense. They disagree when they disagree. They agree when they agree. They don't perform opinions they don't hold. And because of this directness, you always know where you stand with them, which is both rare and enormously trustworthy. What shows is steadiness. They are essentially the same person in every context, with the boss and with the intern, with the famous and with the unknown, with the people who admire them and with the people who don't. They don't expand with approval or contract with criticism. They simply remain themselves, consistently, reliably themselves. What shows is attention to what matters. They are focused on their work, on the people they are with, on the task in front of them, not on their phone, not on the imagined reactions of absent observers, not on the social positioning game that consumes so much of most people's attention. Just here, just now, just this. What shows, ultimately, is freedom, the specific, unmistakable, deeply attractive freedom of someone who is living from the inside out, who has located their authority within themselves and does not need to borrow it from external sources. This is what Stoicism is building. Not a philosophy of cold detachment, not a practice of proud isolation, not an ideology of superiority. but a way of being that is genuinely, deeply, authentically free, because its foundation is not in the fluctuating, unreliable, uncontrollable world of other people's opinions, but in the stable, cultivatable, genuinely yours territory of your own character. This is the power of ignoring people, not the power of not caring about people, but the power of caring about something more than what they think of you. The power of caring about who you actually are and who you are becoming, more than about how you appear. The power of ignoring people is, in the end, the power of hearing yourself, your own values, your own wisdom, your own sense of what is right, over the noise of everything and everyone else. And that voice, once you learn to hear it clearly, never steers you wrong. We have traveled a long way together in this conversation. From the ancient journals of Marcus Aurelius, through the radical teachings of Epictetus, through the careful wisdom of Seneca, and all the way into the specific, practical, daily reality of your modern life. We have talked about control, about the inner citadel, about approval seeking and its costs, about strategic indifference, about silence as power, about the long game of virtue, about Amor Fati, and about the daily practices that build genuine mental strength. If there is one thing I want you to carry from this one sentence, if you had to choose just one, let it be this. Your worth is not determined by other people's perception of you. It is determined by the quality of your character, the honesty of your effort, and the consistency of your return to what you believe is right. Everything else is noise. Now, before you go, I want to ask you genuinely to take one small action. If this video has given you something real, if something here landed, shifted something, you gave you a language for something you already felt but couldn't quite name, then please give this video a like right now. It is one button. It takes 1 second. And it sends a signal that this kind of content, deep, honest, substantive content, is what you want to see more of. Your like genuinely matters for this channel's ability to reach more people. And please leave a comment. Tell me what part of this conversation meant the most to you. Tell me which idea landed hardest. Tell me what you are going to practice, what you are going to release, what you are going to begin. The comment section of this channel is a genuine community people who are seriously committed to growing, to thinking, to becoming more than they were. And your voice is a real and valuable part of that community. Please share this video with someone you care about, with someone who is struggling with what other people think about them, with someone whose peace is being consumed by the noise of social judgment, with someone who needs to hear that there is another way. You might not know how much they need these ideas right now. Share it and trust that it will reach whoever needs it. And if you are not yet subscribed to Stoic Wisdom, please subscribe right now and ring the notification bell every week. We go this deep into the ideas that actually change the way you live, and you should not miss a single one. Finally, if this channel has genuinely added something to your life, if these videos have become part of how you think, how you grow, how you return to your values, please consider supporting us through Super Thanks. That support is what makes it possible for us to keep creating this kind of content at this depth and quality. It is a genuine act of generosity, and it is one that I am profoundly grateful for. To every single person watching this right now, thank you. Thank you for your time, for your attention, for your genuine commitment to growing. In a world that is constantly pulling you toward distraction and shallow engagement, the fact that you sat with this all the way through says something real about who you are. Now go live it. Take what you have learned today into the actual moments that will test you, into the conversation that will challenge you, into the criticism that will sting, into the social situation that will try to pull you off your center. And when you feel the pull, when you feel the familiar gravity of other people's opinions reaching for your peace, remember the inner citadel. Remember the dichotomy of control. Remember that what someone thinks about you exists in their mind, not in reality, and return to yourself. Again and again and again. That is the practice. That is the path. That is the Stoic way. Until next time, remain grounded, remain free, and remain exactly who you are. This is Stoic wisdom.